There we go. Now we're getting started. My name is Ada. I am the creative programming and digital media intern here at Dalnavert Museum, and I'm going to be acting as sort of a moderator for this lecture we're having today. So thank you guys all so much for joining us from all over the place. It's very exciting to be able to virtually have you guys at the museum today. We are gathered virtually on this land we call Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed only 24 years before Dalnavert was built in 1895. This area of Turtle Island is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and is the homeland of the Métis Nation. As I said, this is the 7th installment of the Elizabeth Alloway Lecture Series. Dalnavert Museum is honored to host this series in collaboration with the Winnipeg Foundation Centennial Institute in celebration of Elizabeth Alloway and to shine a spotlight on the Elizabeth Alloway History Scholarship Fund and the Friends of Dalnavert Heritage Fund. You can donate to this fund on the Winnipeg Foundation website, which I encourage you all to do. This $7,500 annual scholarship will support a second-year master's student in researching how women have shaped the history of Canada and understanding the roles of women in Canadian history. This is a joint fund with Dalnavert, so supporting the scholarship fund will also benefit the museum. This fund is named for Elizabeth Alloway, who, along with her husband William, was instrumental in establishing the Winnipeg Foundation in 1921. When Elizabeth died in 1926, she left her entire estate to the foundation, which was over $800,000. She was deeply interested and committed to charitable work, especially when it came to the welfare of children and women, and was interested in the career of nursing. She had a wide range of interests and many friends whom she hosted at her house just down the street from Dalnavert. A socialite and the type of person who would want to be in the know about theater, she might also be interested in the theme of today's talk. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the star of today's show, Kevin Klassen. Kevin is a local actor, director, and award-winning playwright. He is the artistic associate at Echo Theatre and has performed in all of the major and most of the independent theaters in Winnipeg and some across Canada. He's been seen in local film and television and is married to the programming and marketing director here at Dalnavert Museum. Most recently, he put his 2.5-year-old daughter into daycare, so he had some time to work on this talk today. Let me introduce you to Kevin, and Kevin, go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for being here today. And I want to thank Dalnavert Museum for hosting me. And welcome to Bram Stoker, the man inside the monster. To get us started, I just want to spend a moment elaborating a little bit on my history with Bram Stoker. In August 2009, Charlene, my future wife, and I were touring the United Kingdom and found ourselves in Dublin, Ireland on a Sunday. And because of the shortened workday, our sightseeing options were more limited than we had anticipated, and we ended up partaking of a bit of Irish history that hadn't been a priority for either of us: the Bram Stoker Dracula experience. Oddly nestled behind the Westwood Club Fitness Complex, across from Stoker's birthplace at 15 Merino Crescent, the experience was, are you guys all getting this?
We are, it's great, Kevin.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure the slides are working.
Oh, you're not sharing your screen, I'm sorry.
Not sharing my screen. I'm going to go back.
I thought this was just a precursor.
I blew the grand entrance.
It was such a lovely story.
I blew the grand entrance. I got to share my screen.
Sorry about that, Kevin.
That's quite all right. That's my flaw. Oh. Now I'm stuck. No, I'm lost.
Are you on the main Zoom screen right now?
I'm about to get it done.
Okay.
Is everybody seeing my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Share screen. I don't know what's going on. I'm pressing share screen.
There we go.
Now we got it.
Now you've got to pick your window. Excellent. Now we got it.
Yay.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Welcome to Bram Stoker, the man inside the monster. So like I was saying,
Beautiful.
I was in Dublin, Ireland with my wife on a tour of the UK. We woke up on a Sunday morning and a lot of the places we wanted to see were closed because it was Sunday. And so we ended up somewhere we hadn't planned to be, which was the Bram Stoker Dracula Experience, which was oddly nestled behind the Westwood Fitness Center complex across from Stoker's birthplace at 15 Merino Crescent. The experience was essentially a carnival-style haunted house and interpretive center enhanced by spooky music and a short documentary, and you can see me there being spooked. It was a little bit cheesy, but it was a lot of fun. And I should mention that since then, it's known as Castle Dracula Dublin, and it was recently voted #1 attraction by the Ireland Before You Die tourism resource. And while we were there, I learned something about Bram Stoker's life, which to me was astonishing, that he had been the personal business manager and intimate friend of Sir Henry Irving, one of the most influential stage actors in history and the first to be knighted. Further, the documentary suggested that Irving had in fact been the central inspiration for the title character of the best-selling novel of all time, Dracula. I knew immediately that I had to write a play about it. But when I finally sat down to write, I ran into a problem. There was too much to fit into one play, and it was all too compelling for any of it to be discarded. There were too many characters. The list of late 19th century luminaries of Stoker's acquaintance alone is staggering. G.B. Shaw, Mark Twain, Winston Churchill, Lord Alfred Tennyson, Gilbert and Sullivan, Oscar Wilde, Ellen Terry, and Walt Whitman, to name just a few. There were too many potential themes to explore: Victorian morality, bisexuality, 19th century sickness and medicine and technology and literature and theater and xenophobia and European folklore. And there were too many subplots in Stoker's life: his time as an invalid child, his brother, the knighted surgeon, the wife he stole away from Oscar Wilde, his worship of Walt Whitman, his work as a writer, and most crucially, the manner in which Stoker devoted the majority of his life to accomplishing, maintaining, and providing for the artistic vision and personal whims of Henry Irving. And what did it all have to do with his only unequivocal success, Dracula? So I'm still trying to figure out how to write this play. And there's far more to explore than we can possibly squeeze into this lecture, but I'll do what I can. And my plan is to move through Stoker's earlier life, more or less chronologically, touching on some key events and focusing on the voices of some of the real life characters themselves, using letters that have been published and quotes from Stoker's memoir, Personal Remembrances of Henry Irving. I'm also indebted to Barbara Belford's biography and Daniel Farson's biography, The Man Who Wrote Dracula, and Google. So let's see what happens. Bram Stoker was born on November 8th, 1947, and raised in the coastal suburb of Clontarf, Dublin. In his memoir, Stoker writes, "In my babyhood, I understand, to be often at the point of death. Certainly, till I was about 7 years old, I never knew what it was to stand upright. I was naturally thoughtful, and the leisure of long illness gave opportunity for many thoughts which were fruitful according to their kind in later years. Now, in the original manuscript, he elaborates, "When the nursery bell rang at night, my mother would run to the room expecting to find me dying." And he chose to cut this last line from the official published version. And that kind of self-editing and vague understatement is typical of the way Stoker wrote and spoke of himself. And it stands in contrast with the extravagant detail and effusiveness with which he tends to approach every other subject, especially the subject of Henry Irving. He kept his own private thoughts and affairs close to his chest. But I think we can infer from this brief recollection a few things which must have impacted his later life, including his writing. We can imagine that the first 7 years of his life were filled with loneliness, fear, and worry, and a dependence upon others, chiefly his mother, far beyond the age and extent of most children. He must have had great stretches of time to pass with little more than his own thoughts and imagination, and whatever stories of the outside world were brought to him by family members. His mother, Charlotte, who was something of a feminist activist, would hold him in thrall with recollections of her family surviving an outbreak of cholera in 1832 in her hometown of Sligo. In 1875, after she and Stoker's father had moved to France with his two sisters, he had his mother recount her stories in a letter. "It was the cholera, which for the first time appeared in Western Europe. Its bitter, strange kiss and man's want of experience or knowledge of its nature, or how best to resist its attacks, added, if anything could, to its horrors. One poor traveler was taken ill on the roadside some miles from the town. A pit was dug, and with long poles they pushed him into it, still alive, and covered him up quick. All of the nurses died, one after another, and no one could be found to fill their places except low women of the worst description. They were always more than half drunk, and such scenes were perpetrated there as would make the flesh creep to hear of. One man brought his sick wife to the hospital on his back. He had tied a red neckerchief tightly round her waist to relieve the pain. When he returned in the evening, they told him that she had died and was lying in the dead house. He asked permission to retrieve her body, to give it decent burial. As he crept through the dead house, searching, he saw the corner of his red kerchief sticking out from under several corpses, and he began to remove them. When he finally reached his wife, her body was warm. There was still life in her. He carried her home, and she soon recovered." Stoker used her account as inspiration for The Invisible Giant, an allegoric short story for children about a humanoid mist which, visible only to a virtuous young orphan girl, lays waste to her entire village. It's easy to believe that the images from his mother's letters lingered in his imagination when he was conceiving Dracula. Another key influence in Stoker's childhood was, of course, his father, Abraham Stoker. A modest, reserved, and dutiful servant for more than 50 years at Dublin Castle, the center of Irish bureaucracy, the elder Stoker was 48 years old when Bram was born. I think the three main things he inherited from his father were: one, a much shorter-lived post at Dublin Castle as a petty sessions clerk, which resulted in his first book, a self-admittedly dry-as-dust how-to called The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland. Two, a sense of personal loyalty and humility, which bordered on obsequiousness. And three, a love of the theater. Among Abraham Stoker's very few personal indulgences was regular attendance at the theater, and upon return from a performance, he would adoringly recount his experience of each play for young Bram, reporting which actors had impressed him, none ever so much as the great Edmund Kean. This laid the grounds for Bram's own devotion to the theater, and ultimately an event which changed the course of his life and the future of Western theater, literature, and popular culture to this very day. But before we get to that, let's explore a few more fascinating aspects of Stoker's youth. Little is known or written about Bram Stoker's life between the age of 7, when he left his sickbed, and his time at Trinity College, so let's pick up our story there. I now turn the narrative over to Stoker himself. My friends call me Bram. I live at 43 Harcourt Street, Dublin. I am a clerk in the service of the Crown on a small salary. I am 24 years old, have been champion at our athletic sports, Trinity College, and have won about a dozen cups. I have also been president of the College Philosophical Society and an art and theatrical critic of a daily paper. I am 6'2" high and 12 stone weight, naked, and used to be 41 or 42 inches round the chest. I am ugly, but strong and determined, and have a large bump over my eyebrows. I have a heavy jaw and a big mouth and thick lips, sensitive nostrils, a snub nose and straight hair. I am equal in temper and cool in disposition, and have a large amount of self-control, and am naturally secretive to the world. I take a delight in letting people I don't like, people of mean or cruel or sneaking or cowardly disposition, see the worst side of me. I have a large number of acquaintances and some 5 or 6 friends, all of which latter body care much for me. This is a quotation from a fan letter Stoker wrote to Walt Whitman, the great American poet and thinker. Dated February 18th, 1872, it's actually the first of 2 letters he wrote, which he didn't have the courage to send until 4 years later, on Valentine's Day. Here's a passage from the second letter. The 4 years which have elapsed have made me love your work fourfold, and I can truly say that I have ever spoken as your friend. You know what hostile criticism your work sometimes evokes here, and I wage a perpetual war with many friends on your behalf. The years which have passed have not been uneventful to me, and I have felt and thought and suffered much in them, and I can truly say that from you I have had much pleasure and consolation. We have just had tonight a hot debate on your genius at the Fortnightly Club, in which I had the privilege of putting forward my views, I think with success. Emboldened and inflamed by the heat of debate and no doubt alcohol, Stoker enclosed and mailed the 2 letters together. Whitman kept them, and many years later, his friend Horace Traubel published them. There is something very revealing in the way Stoker describes the practical details of his own character and physical appearance, modest and forthright. Most of his stories and novels, including Dracula, are populated by strong, heroically capable men such as the one he grew into, who defy convention, if necessary, to uphold convention, and to defend what is right and good. There is also much to ponder in the way he describes his responses to Whitman's writing. Here's another quote. I would like to call you comrade and talk to you as men who are not poets do not often talk. I think at first a man would be ashamed, for a man cannot in a moment break the habit of comparative reticence that has become second nature to him. But I know I would not long be ashamed to be natural before you. You are a true man, and I would like to be one myself, and so I would be towards you as a brother and as a pupil to his master. I have to thank you for many happy hours, for I have read your poems with my door locked late at night, and I have read them on the seashore, where I could look all round me and see no more sign of human life than the ships out at sea. How sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eye and a child's wishes to feel that he can speak to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me, but at all events, I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. Now, what Stoker is responding to and has been publicly and passionately defending is Walt Whitman's controversial, groundbreaking, convention-defying poetry, as compiled and edited in 1868 by William Michael Rossetti. Poems by Walt Whitman. And much of the language Stoker uses is a conscious reflection of Whitman's writing. But just possibly with you on a high hill, first watching lest any person for miles around approach unawares, or possibly with you sailing at sea, or on the beach of the sea, or some quiet island, Here, to put your lips upon mine, I permit you, with the comrade's long dwelling kiss, or the new husband's kiss, for I am the new husband, and I am the comrade, or, if you will, thrusting me beneath your clothing, where I may feel the throbs of your heart, or rest upon your hip. Carry me when you go forth over land or sea. Now, among all of the things that can be said about the poetry of Walt Whitman, it is also famously abundant with homoeroticism. Though Rossetti, by his own admission, had chosen to omit entirely every poem which could, with any tolerable fairness, be deemed offensive to the feelings or morals of propriety in this peculiarly nervous age, including Song of Myself, the book was a scandal in Ireland. And by the time he mailed his letters, Stoker would have acquired and devoured all that Rossetti had denied him. Now, what it might say about Bram Stoker that the existence of this book meant so much to him is certainly worth contemplating, but I have no interest in trying to define it. If you were to take the trouble to read Dracula or any biography of Bram Stoker and then read Leaves of Grass or Song of Myself, it will be clear that Stoker is not overstating the impact they had on his life. The passage which precedes the previous quote from a poem best known as Calamus, but in Rossetti's edition it's called Fit Audience, it contains a warning, which is easily applicable to what was about to become the defining relationship in Stoker's life. Who is he that would become my follower? Who would sign himself a candidate for my affections? Are you he? The way is suspicious, the result slow, uncertain, maybe destructive. You would have to give up all else. I alone would expect to be your God, sole and exclusive. Your novitiate would even then be long and exhausting. The whole past theory of your life and all conformity to the lives around you would have to be abandoned. Therefore, release me now, before troubling yourself any further. Let go your hand from my shoulders. Put me down and depart on your way. Stoker wasn't prepared at that time to give up all else to follow Whitman, but soon enough found another master to whom he would surrender. But before we get to that, let's talk about Oscar Wilde. Through his work as an arts critic and his heavy involvement with Trinity College, Stoker became a frequent guest at the home of Sir William and Lady Jane Wilde, most famously the parents of Oscar Wilde. Stoker was friends with Oscar's brother Willie, and though 7 years his senior, would no doubt have been on familiar and cordial terms with Oscar. Given their shared interest in theater and writing and the enormous difference between their temperaments and personal style, their relationship was likely to have been competitive, if not antagonistic. It could not have helped that they were courting the same woman at the same time, though Wilde spent much of that time away from Dublin. In any case, when Stoker successfully proposed marriage to Florence Balcombe, Wilde wrote to her, requesting the return of a small gold crucifix he had given her. I need hardly say that I would not ask it from you if it was anything you valued, but worthless though the trinket may be, it serves as a memory of 2 sweet years, the sweetest of all the years of my youth, and I should like to have it always with me. Though you have not thought it worthwhile to let me know of your marriage, still I cannot leave Ireland without sending you my wishes that you may be happy. We stand apart now, but the little cross will serve to remind of the bygone days, and though we shall never meet again after I leave Ireland, still I shall always remember you at prayer. Now, it's unlikely that Stoker should ever have read this letter himself, but this quote from Dracula is a mysterious coincidence. Bless that good woman who hung the crucifix round my neck, for it is a comfort and a strength to me whenever I touch it. Is it that there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or that it is a medium, a tangible help in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort? Of course, poor Oscar had no way of knowing that Florence and Stoker would remain ubiquitous in his life, as all three were soon to become icons of the London theatre crowd. On one particular occasion in 1881, before the opening performance of Lord Alfred Tennyson's play The Cup, Florence, was to appear on stage as a Vestal Virgin in one of Irving's signature large crowd scenes, and Ellen Terry received a note from Wilde. I send you some flowers, 2 crowns. Will you accept one of them, whichever you think will suit you best? The other, don't think me treacherous, Nellie, but the other please give to Florrie from yourself. I should like to think she was wearing something of mine the first night she comes on the stage, that anything of mine should touch her. Of course, if you think, but you won't think she will suspect. How could she? She thinks I never loved her, thinks I forget. My God, how could I? Now, this would have been shortly before Wilde met and fell in love with Constance Lloyd, whom he would marry 3 years later. Already at that point, a figure of controversy for his involvement in the aesthetic and decadent movements, his effeminate personal style, and flouting of conformity in general, Oscar Wilde would acquire a life of fame and infamy with his short novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. This was followed by a series of hugely successful and scandalous stage plays, culminating in The Importance of Being Earnest, a comedy of manners masterpiece. All of his success would come crashing in on his head in a manner that would have had an enormous impact on Bram Stoker, indeed on all of English society. But we're now ahead of ourselves, so let's get back to Bram Stoker. In Personal Remembrances, Stoker writes, I took up my work with Irving at Birmingham on December 9th, 1878, having in the meantime altered my whole business life, arranged for the completion of my book on the duties of petty sessions clerks, and last, not least, having got married, an event which had already been arranged for a year later. Irving was staying at the Plough and Harrow, and he was mightily surprised when he found that I had a wife, the wife, with me. The wife, of course, was Florence Balcombe, whom he had married on December 4th. Given his private nature, it's not too surprising that his book makes no other mention of his wife except to acknowledge that she occasionally joined him for dinner, not even going so far as to name her. It is surprising that he appears not to have mentioned her existence or the fact of their engagement to the man whom he considered a soulmate and with whom he was preparing to go into business. Perhaps some instinct told him that this news would not be welcome to Irving, that perhaps he already sensed how all-encompassing Irving's expectations would be. Or perhaps the significance of his engagement and marriage simply didn't register with Stoker in comparison with the significance of his new career. In any case, in 1878, at the age of 31, he found himself twice pledged, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death. But let's go back a little further to see how it happened. Here's Bram Stoker. The first time I ever saw Henry Irving was at the Theatre Royal, Dublin, on the evening of Wednesday, August 28th, 1867. What I saw, to my amazement and delight, was a patrician figure as real as the persons of one's dreams, handsome, distinguished, self-dependent, compact of grace and slumbrous energy, a man of quality who stood out from his surroundings on the stage as of being of another social world, full of dash and fine irony, and whose ridicule seemed to bite. An inoffensive egoist, veiled and shrouded in his fine quality of manner. However, on looking over the newspapers, I found hardly a word of even judicious comment. I did not see Henry Irving again till May 1871 in Royal Albury's comedy, Two Roses. Well do I remember the delight of that performance. It stood out star-like, so complete that to this day I have been unable to get it out of my mind as a reality. But there was not a word in any of the papers of the acting of any of the accomplished players who took part in it, not even the mention of their names. More than 5 years elapsed before I saw Henry Irving again. Those 5 years were to him a triumphant progress in his art and fame. I had, when we next met, been for 5 years a dramatic critic. My growing discontent with the local newspapers had culminated with the neglect of Two Roses. I asked the proprietor of one of the Dublin newspapers to allow me to write on the subject. He told me frankly that the paper could not afford to pay for such special work. I replied that I would gladly do it without fee or reward. It was therefore with very great interest that we regarded in 1876 the playing of this actor, who was accepted in the main as a new giant. Indeed, I said in my critical article thus: Mr. Irving holds in the minds of all who have seen him a high place as an artist, and by some he is regarded as the Garrick of our age, and so we shall judge him by the highest standard which we know. Mr. Irving deserves not only the highest praise that can be accorded, but the loving gratitude of all to whom his art is dear. The role was Hamlet. That he was pleased with the review of his work was proved by the fact that he asked me that we should be introduced. He had learned that I could appreciate high effort, and so after dinner, he said he would like to recite for me Thomas Hood's poem, The Dream of Eugene Aram. Now, The Dream of Eugene Aram is about a young schoolmaster who commits a murder and is then tormented by his guilty conscience and a body that refuses to stay buried. That experience I can never forget. Such was Irving's commanding force, so great was the magnetism of his genius, so profound was the sense of his dominance that I sat spellbound. Here was incarnate power, incarnate passion, so close that one could meet it eye to eye, within touch of the outstretched hand, his very soul aflame in the light of his abiding horror. Then came the awful horror on the murderer's face, as the ghost in his brain seemed to take external shape before his eyes. After this climax of horror, the actor was able by art and habit to control himself to the narrative mood, whilst he spoke the few concluding lines of the poem. Then he collapsed, half fainting. After a few seconds of stony silence following his collapse, I burst out into something like a violent fit of hysterics. I can now have some glimpse of his compelling motive when he went into his bedroom and after a couple of minutes brought me out his photograph with an inscription on it, the ink still wet. My dear friend Stoker, God bless you. God bless you. Henry Irving, Dublin, December 3rd, 1876. Soul had looked into soul. From that hour began a friendship as profound, as close, as lasting as can be between two men. Till death do they part. Here's a little background on Henry Irving. When Irving, born Henry Brodrib in 1838, first entered the field of acting, he was accused of mumbling, his Cornish accent considered unintelligible. He was unusual in appearance, with thick, longish hair and a beardless face, and had an odd, slightly stooped gait. His strengths were an intense and fierce intelligence, and an even fiercer pathological sense of commitment to the art of theater. He gave painstaking detail to every facet of character he played, digging deeply into his characters' historical context and their personal circumstance, and applying the most current theories in human psychology and behavior to his own studious observations of the world around him. He then applied what he had learned to every word his characters spoke, what clothing they wore, and every action they appeared to execute in the play. Audiences were at first either riveted or revolted, as they were still accustomed to a physicality which was more representational of real life than like real life, and a vocal approach which was much more declamatory and musical than that of everyday speech. Irving was among the very first English-speaking actors who actually sought to do the things the characters do, as if they were really doing it, and to respond to the things that were done to them as if they were really happening. For the English theater, it was a revolution. For Bram Stoker, a revelation. According to him, here's what happened next. During that visit to Dublin, 1876, Irving received at the hands of the university 2 honors, one of them unique. The first was an address to be presented in the dining hall by the graduates and undergraduates of the university. As I had originated the idea, I was asked by the committee to write the draft address. One of the paragraphs, when completed, ran as follows. For the delight and instruction that we, in common with our fellow citizens, have derived from all your impersonations, we tender you our sincere thanks. But it is something more than gratitude for personal pleasure or personal improvement that moves us to offer this public homage to your genius. Acting such as yours ennobles and elevates the stage and serves to restore it to its true function as a potent instrument for intellectual and moral culture. Throughout your too brief engagement, our stage has been a school of true art, a purifier of the passions, and a nurse of heroic sentiments. You have even succeeded in commending it to the favor of a large portion of society, large and justly influential, who usually hold aloof from the theater. To this, Irving replied suitably, I feel not merely the personal pride of individual success which you thus avow, but that the far nobler work which I aim at is in truth begun. When I think that you, the upholders of the classics in every age, have just flung aside the traditions of 3 centuries and have acknowledged the true union of poet and actor, my heart swells with a great pride that I should be the recipient of such acknowledgement. I trust with all my soul that the reform which you suggest may ere long be carried out, and that that body to whom is justly entrusted our higher moral education may recognize in the stage a medium for the accomplishment of such ends. What you have done today is a mighty stride in this direction. In my profession, it will be hailed with joy and gladness. It must elevate not only the aims of individual actors, but our calling in the eyes of the world. It was a bold declaration of intent and a pretty great speech, but it wouldn't be long before such speeches would be composed by Stoker himself. The second honor given on the same day, December 11th, 1876, was a university night, which included a performance of Hamlet, and from which Irving was literally carried away in a carriage, to which a few hundred audience members, including Stoker, had harnessed themselves. As Stoker goes on to describe, after that glorious night, Henry Irving, with brave heart and high hopes, now justified by a new form of success, left Ireland for his own country, where fresh triumphs awaited him. But before we move on to those, I just want to address this idea that Stoker expresses in his speech, his conviction that the true function of the stage is that of a potent instrument for intellectual and moral culture, a purifier of the passions and a nurse of heroic sentiments. Essentially, what he's describing is Aristotle's theory of catharsis, which is generally understood, at least by the Encyclopedia Britannica, to be the purification or purgation of the emotions, especially pity and fear, primarily through art. Aristotle states that the purpose of tragedy is to arouse terror and pity and thereby effect the catharsis of these emotions. For Stoker to reclaim this as theater's true function after centuries in which Great Britain's moral guardians had and continued to condemn stage plays as the devil's playground, fell directly in line with Irving's ambitions. This conviction, I think, also helps to reconcile Stoker's literary predilection for the lurid and the macabre with his strong sense of Protestant morality, both of which aspects of his personality seem to have increased as he grew older. There must have been much going on inside of Bram Stoker throughout his life, which he felt needed purging. But let's pick up where we left off. Stoker and Irving saw much of each other after that night. Whenever Irving returned to play in Dublin, Stoker was his companion and guide, and Irving began staying at the house of Stoker's brother, Thornley. They ate together, drank together, and even attended a wrestling match together. As Stoker tells us, we had now been close friends for over 2 years. We understood each other's nature, needs, and ambitions, and had a mutual confidence, each towards the other in his own way, rare amongst men. It did not, I think, surprise any of us when 6 weeks after his departure, I received a telegram from him from Glasgow, where he was then playing, asking me if I could go to see him at once on important business. He told me that he had arranged to take the management of the Lyceum into his own hands. He asked me if I would give up the civil service and join him, I to take charge of his business as acting manager. I accepted at once. In the morning, I sent in my resignation and made by telegram certain domestic and other arrangements of supreme importance to me at that time and ever since. I'm guessing that when he writes certain domestic and other arrangements of supreme importance, he's referring to his marriage and wedding night. And I can't help but wonder if he's winking at us. If so, he presumes a lot about the reader. So now that we're up to date again, let's travel a little more quickly before we start to run out of time. The first season at the Lyceum under Irving and Stoker's management was a success. From a financial perspective, this was due to Stoker taking scrupulous personal control of everything from production budgets, touring schedules, and payroll to the arrangement and pricing of seats. If one wanted to be in the front row or in a box, they either paid through the nose or went through Bram Stoker to get it. From an artistic perspective, the vision was all Irving's, founded on Shakespeare and following Shakespeare's instinct and ability to marry high art with popular appeal. A central component of that vision was the woman he had recruited to play Ophelia opposite his Hamlet, who would become his romantic partner on stage and in life for the next 24 years. Ellen Terry was simply one of the greatest and best loved actors of all time, combining the public appeal of Julia Roberts with the skill and pedigree of Meryl Streep. She and Stoker doted on one another, to the extent that she gave him a signed photo with the dedication, "To my ma, I am her dutiful child." Of her, Stoker said, "She has to the full in her nature whatever quality it is that corresponds to what we call virility in a man." It's quite likely that Ellen Terry was the primary model for the character of Mina in Dracula. And on the subject of dutiful children, on December 29th or December 30th or December 31st, depending on who you ask, in 1879, after over just a year of marriage, Florence gave birth to their only child, a son they named Irving Noel Thornley Stoker. To avoid confusion, and perhaps to spare the child from hearing his name regularly muttered by his mother in a tone of resentment, he went by Noel. Because of the all-consuming demands of his job, Bram was unlikely to have seen much of Noel or Florence, except when on vacation. But he did dedicate Under the Sunset, a collection of short stories for children which included The Invisible Giant, "To my son, whose angel doth behold the face of the king." This is a reference to his story cycle with unmistakable echoes of Christianity. In 1883, Stoker took the Lyceum Company on tour in America and finally met Walt Whitman face to face. The conversation was constrained somewhat by the presence of Irving, who had insisted on coming along, though he had very little knowledge of Whitman's writing. But Stoker's memory of the occasion is glowing. "When it came to my own turn to have a chat with Walt Whitman, I found him all that I had ever dreamed of or wished for him in him. Large-minded, broad-viewed, tolerant to the last degree, incarnate sympathy, understanding with an insight that seemed more than human. No wonder that men opened their hearts to him, told him their secrets, their woes and hopes and griefs and loves. A man amongst men." He saw Whitman twice more, and on the final occasion, he urged him to publish an expurgated edition of his poetry. "If you will only allow your friends to do this, they will only want to cut about 100 lines in all. Your books will go into every house in America. Is not that worth the sacrifice?" He answered at once, as though his mind had long ago been made up, and he did not want any special thinking. "It would not be any sacrifice. So far as I'm concerned, they might cut 1,000. It's not that, it is quite another matter. When I wrote as I did, I thought I was doing right, and right makes for good. I think so still. I think that all that God made is for good, that the work of his hands is clean in all ways, if used as he intended. If I was wrong, I have done harm, and for that I deserve to be punished by being forgotten. It has been, and cannot not be. No, I shall never cut a line so long as I live. Whitman died in 1892, 5 years later. Stoker himself was not nearly so steely in his resolve. In a letter he sent to former Prime Minister W.E. Gladstone, which accompanied a copy of Dracula, he wrote, "The book is necessarily full of horrors, but I trust that these are calculated to cleanse the mind by pity and terror. At any rate, there is nothing base in the book. I hope it is not irreverent." Indeed, in 1908, he published an article advocating for the forcible censorship of works of fiction, meant by both authors and publishers to bring to the winning of commercial success the forces of evil inherent in man. With no apparent sense of irony or self, he even works in a reference to Whitman. In 1888, Irving gave the world his production of Macbeth. In addition to Ellen Terry's redefining performance of Lady Macbeth as not a monstrosity, but a woman, a mistaken woman, but first of all, a wife, which was immortalized by John Singer Sargent's portrait, this production filled Bram Stoker's head with images that would echo throughout his novel Dracula. The trio of female vampires who seek to prey on Jonathan Harker are obvious reflections of Shakespeare's Weird Sisters, and both works are saturated with blood imagery. But most striking to me are certain images of Irving as Macbeth and their similarity to Stoker's description of Count Dracula. A tall old man, clean shaven save for a long white mustache. His face was a very strong aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily around the temples. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy mustache, was fixed and rather cruel looking. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. In 1890, Stoker first began making notes for what would become Dracula. He liked to tell people that the story came to him in a feverish nightmare after eating too much dressed crab. His story began to evolve in earnest while he and his family were vacationing at the English seaside resort of Whitby, a place which figures large in Stoker's plans for Dracula and in Dracula's plans to conquer the world. Now, I'm hoping to save some time for you to share your thoughts and answer any questions if I can. So at this point, I'm just going to drop in some very brief key points of interest without any commentary. On May 25th, 1895, both Henry Irving and Stoker's brother Thornley received a knighthood from Queen Victoria. On the same day, Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency and would be sentenced to 2 years in prison. On May 18th, 1897, a staged reading of Dracula, as adapted by Stoker, was presented at the Lyceum, ostensibly to protect dramatic rights and probably to convince Irving of its viability as a vehicle for him. It succeeded only on the first count, and Irving is apocryphally said to have declared it dreadful. On May 26, 1897, Dracula was published. Exactly 1 week later, Wilde was released from prison and entered into exile. He died 4 years later. On October 13th, 1905, on a farewell tour, Irving died in the arms of his dresser in the lobby of his hotel. 1 year later, Personal Remembrances of Henry Irving was published. Of the more than 1,000 names Stoker took the trouble to list as guests of interest at the Lyceum, Oscar Wilde was not included, nor, for that matter, was Florence Balcombe Stoker. Later that year, shortly after a golden jubilation celebration of Ellen Terry, Stoker suffered a debilitating stroke and was often bedridden for a time. 5 years later, on April 20th, 2012, Bram Stoker died. Some say of syphilis, but probably of kidney failure. Not long after his death, there began a reversal of statures between Irving and Stoker. F.W. Murnau released a highly influential film adaptation of Dracula called Nosferatu, which Florence Stoker had nearly wiped clean from the face of the earth due to copyright infringement. She then sanctioned a wildly successful stage adaptation, which led directly to the blockbuster Bela Lugosi film version. As the 20th century crept along, movies took over, and a new guard of stage actors pushed Irving's memory further and further into the past, while Bram Stoker and his creation became ubiquitous, ensuring that his name will likely never be forgotten. We almost certainly wouldn't have had one without the other.
Kevin, thank you so much. That was really wonderful and really fascinating. So everyone, if you have all had a chance to absorb and digest all that information a little bit, we'll give Kevin a chance to have a sip of water there, but you're more than welcome to ask any questions you may have. You're allowed to unmute yourself, absolutely, but also if you'd prefer to just put your question in the chat, I can ask it for you. So feel free to do that. While people organize their thoughts, Kevin, I have a small question for you. I was wondering, with all this research you've done, do you have just like a favorite fun fact or something that surprised you the most? That's just like your favorite little thing to bring out at parties or something?
Well, I think to me, the most interesting dynamic, apart from the obvious one with Henry Irving, is this devotion to Walt Whitman and what appears to me this tension between a man who could appreciate Walt Whitman in Walt Whitman's time so thoroughly and so deeply and be so affected by that. And on the other hand, write an article arguing for the forcible censorship of fiction and literature. Like, to me, that those two instincts exist in the same person is really neat and something that I want to try to dig into. And most recently, I was reminded of the fact that not only did Bram Stoker write a novel called The Man, which is about a woman who passes herself as a man, but he also wrote a book called Famous Imposters, with a chapter entirely devoted to men who pass themselves as women. So there seems to be a current of kind of gender fluidity or gender questioning in Stoker's personal writings and in some of the themes that he explores in his writing that is very interesting to me as well. He describes himself as having a woman's eyes, and yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions for Kevin?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Kevin, can you hear me?
I sure can. Hi, Neil.
How you doing? So anyways, do you think towards the end of his life, do you think Stoker was kind of torn because of his Catholicism, sort of a guilt complex that may have arose because of how he felt about various things over the years?
Yeah, I think I'm sure he was. I think he felt that way. I think he felt that way all of his life. Just for the record, it would have been Protestant, Irish Protestant.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. But naturally, in a country that was heavy in Catholicism.
Yeah. And in fact, he apologizes a little bit for the use of the crucifix as a power against the undead, because he knew that would smack too much of Catholic iconism and worshiping. So yeah, I think through his whole life, he had thoughts and impulses that went against the grain of his religious teachings. I think his mother did too. Yeah, he loved hanging out with the wilds, who were very unconventional and nonconformist. Almost all of his books, when he's not advocating for censorship, he's writing about, he's including subjects that are lurid and kind of a little bit taboo. And yeah, I think the thing that probably affected him the most toward the end of his life, aside from his strokes and whatever other illnesses he was suffering, I think probably dealing with who he was now that he wasn't Henry Irving's man anymore, and the fact that he'd had a modicum of literary success, and he was certainly well liked and appreciated by his compatriots, but he would have had no sense whatsoever that posterity would hold him, and so yeah, I think anytime somebody completely devotes their life to a thing, whether it's a career or an art form or a person, when that thing leaves them, it can leave you really reeling. And to be now being cared for by his wife in his illness after so many years of not being there for her would have been a real interesting family dynamic, I think, too, and probably would have made him feel a number of different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially since the fact that he had spent so much of his early life basically, laying down, and then in his youth became a very vigorous man.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he's being cared for by his wife at the end of it all.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting dynamic. Are you familiar with an author named David Skal? S-K-A-L?
I am, yeah. I know of his book as well. I haven't read it. I've read quite a few excerpts from it, but I haven't sat down and read the whole book. I'm definitely going to before I work any more on this play.
Yeah, I've read the whole book. To be honest, it's a bit long. It could use some good editing because he's obviously enthralled with his subject and perhaps lost some perspective about what was actually interesting or not. But he does go at length, of course, about the whole relationship with Whitman and Irving. And of course, he provides more depth on the whole origin of Dracula.
Well, it's kind of appropriate because, in my opinion, Bram Stoker really, really could go on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he is verbose. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So you were mentioning your project. Do you feel it's something, with some kind of staging, do you feel it's something that's so far in the future, or is it more sort of within reach?
I think I have an idea very lately for a stage piece that would work, that would free me of having the compulsion to include as many historical details and facts and themes as I want to. But I also have thought for a long time that Bram Stoker's life should be a television series. And so I kind of, in the back of my mind, I plan to try to start developing that.
So something kind of episodic.
Yeah, I think so. Like it's just so interesting. I think from the day he was born to the day he died, there's just so much to mine there, and so many subsidiary characters that yeah, I think it would, a couple of seasons for sure on television would be filled.
All right, thank you so much. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a quick one. Hi.
Hi.
So it sounds like he was sick for a little while after, before he died. Did he produce any works during that time?
He did, yeah. His second most successful novel was published, I think, 2 years before he died, and that was The Lair of the White Worm. And I haven't read it yet. I remember watching a Ken Russell film adaptation of it in my early 20s. And it's a bit of a mind blower. It's a little bit a little bit Lovecraftian, and it's a lot of people speculate that he was under the influence of some kind of drugs or brain fever as he was writing it. Yeah, and Famous Imposters came out. He did a lot of writing for magazines and newspapers, essays. So yeah, he remained pretty productive right up till the end.
Okay, yeah, because I was just curious if he produced any more works after Irving died, or if his styles changed in any noticeable way.
As far as I can tell, he kept basically writing about the same things, but with Lair the White Worm, it got really intense.
Thank you.
Sounds like another one to add to our reading list.
Yeah.
Well, I guess unless there's anyone else that has any urgent questions, we'll say thank you and so long to everyone. From all of us at Dalnavert Museum, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Kevin, for educating us today. So yeah, thanks a million, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
And come to Dalnavert and see the Halloween programming.
Yeah, come and see our Halloween programming. Thanks, Kevin.